The rain didn't just fall on Philadelphia, it owned the city. It hammered against the grimy window of my third-floor office, a relentless percussion that had been my only companion for the past 72 hours. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, old paper, and the general miasma of forgotten cases. I was staring at a photograph of a man named Richard Miller kissing a woman who was decidedly not Mrs. Miller. It was standard, soul-crushing work. The kind that paid the bills but chipped away at whatever part of me still believed in anything noble. I was a private investigator, a title that sounded far more exciting than it was. In reality, I was a professional skeptic, a purveyor of inconvenient truths. Formerly an investigative journalist, I'd traded the pursuit of systemic corruption for the banality of human fallibility after a story on City Hall malfeasance got my source fired, blacklisted, and ultimately broken. I learned then that some truths do more harm than good, and that institutions, be they civic or corporate, have a way of protecting themselves that defies all logic and morality. So, I went private. Less impact, but cleaner hands. The buzz from the intercom was a jarring intrusion. My office building didn't have a doorman, just a rusty speaker box that gargled voices into static. "Yeah," I grunted. "Package for a Thorn?" A young voice squeaked, barely audible over the storm. I wasn't expecting anything. "Leave it in the lobby." The sender said it had to be hand-delivered. Signature required. With a sigh that felt like it came from my bones, I buzzed him in. A few minutes later, a kid who couldn't have been more than 18 stood dripping in my doorway, holding a slim, rectangular package wrapped in plain brown paper. He looked terrified, as if my cluttered office was the antechamber to hell. I signed his digital pad with a scribble, and he practically fled back into the deluge. I tore open the paper. Inside was not a box, but a heavy, cream-colored vellum envelope. There was no return address. It was sealed with a disc of dark blue wax, impressed with a simple, stark image, a compass rose, but with the cardinal directions unmarked. It was elegant, anachronistic, and deeply unsettling. I slid it open with a letter opener I usually used for cleaning under my fingernails. The single sheet of paper inside was just as heavy as the envelope. The words were typed, the slightly uneven imprints suggesting an old manual typewriter. "Mr. Thorne, your discretion in the matter of the waterfront ghost did not go unnoticed. We require a similar expertise for a matter of grave importance. We understand you value logic and tangible evidence above all. That is precisely why we have chosen you. A situation has developed that is testing the limits of both. Await our call. Do not attempt to trace this communication." The waterfront ghost was a case from 2 years ago. A shipping magnate had vanished, and his family hired me after the police hit a dead end. I found him living under a new name in Oregon, having faked his death to escape the crushing weight of his life. I reported him found, but omitted the details, allowing the family to handle the fallout privately. It was the last time I'd felt I'd done something genuinely right. Whoever sent this letter had deep, specific knowledge of my work. The air in the room suddenly felt colder. The rain against the glass sounded less like a rhythm and more like a warning. My old phone, a burner I kept for paranoid clients, rang. The screen read blocked number. I hesitated for a second, then answered. "Thorne, Mr. Thorne. This is the follow-up to the letter you just received." The voice was female, her English crisp and devoid of any discernible accent. It was a voice accustomed to authority, calm and precise. "I trust you are alone." "Just me and the ghosts of bad decisions," I said, my attempt at levity falling flat in the silence that followed. "We need to meet. There is an antiquarian bookshop at the corner of Arch and 12th called The Scribe's Nook. Be in the history section in 45 minutes. Come alone." Before I could ask who we was, she hung up. I stared at the phone, then at the cryptic note. Every instinct, honed by years of sniffing out lies and manipulation, screamed at me to burn the letter, toss the phone, and go back to my pictures of Richard Miller. But my curiosity, that treacherous, long-dormant part of the old journalist, was piqued. This was different. This wasn't about cheating spouses or embezzling partners. This felt significant. 40 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy oak door of the scribe's nook. A small bell chimed. The air smelled of leather, aging paper, and wood polish. It was a sanctuary from the storm outside, silent and still. Towering shelves formed narrow canyons of books, disappearing into the shadows above. I navigated my way to the back, to a sign that read history and cartography. She was standing with her back to me, examining a large, leather-bound atlas. She was tall and slender, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored gray pantsuit. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. As I approached, she closed the atlas with a soft thud and turned. She looked to be in her late 40s, with intelligent, dark eyes that assessed me in a single, sweeping glance. "Mr. Thorne, thank you for coming," she said, her voice the same as on the phone. She didn't offer a name or a handshake. "You have my attention," I said, crossing my arms. "What's this about?" "It's about people who are erased," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Not killed, not kidnapped for ransom. They simply cease to be present." She gestured to a small wooden table with 2 chairs. "My name is irrelevant. You may call me Miss Dubois. I represent a private, lay organization. Think of us as risk managers for institutions whose primary currency is faith. Our purpose is to address sensitive issues that, if mishandled, could cause irreparable damage and widespread panic." She placed a slim, unmarked manila folder on the table between us. "We are facing a pattern of disappearances. Quiet, baffling, and escalating." I sat down, my eyes fixed on the folder. "What kind of disappearances?" "Nuns," she said, the word landing with quiet force. "Members of cloistered and semi-cloistered Catholic orders across the country." I couldn't help but scoff. Women change their minds. Decide the cloistered life isn't for them. It happens. "It does," she conceded, pushing the folder towards me. "But not like this. Open it." I did. The first page was a photograph of a woman in her late 60s. She wore a traditional habit, and her face was lined with wrinkles, but her eyes were bright, and a gentle, serene smile played on her lips. Her name was Sister Agnes. Sister Agnes of the Convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Solitude in Hemlock Creek, Pennsylvania, Miss Dubois explained. A member of her order for 51 years. 2 weeks ago, she failed to appear for matins. The prioress, concerned, went to her cell. The door was locked from the inside. When they finally forced it open, the room was empty. Her window is on the 2nd floor, with iron bars cemented into the stone frame. Nothing was disturbed. I flipped through the pages. A sparse police report, officially closing the case, concluding she'd left of her own accord. Then an inventory list. "Look closer," Miss Dubois urged. Her personal effects were untouched. Her breviary, her glasses, and on her nightstand, a rosary made of olive wood. It was a gift from her mother on the day she took her final vows. Her voice softened slightly. "A woman like Sister Agnes does not leave her vows, Mr. Thorne. And if by some impossible chance she did, she would not leave her mother's rosary behind. It would be like leaving a part of her own body." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my rain-soaked coat. This was the detail that snagged, the piece of grit in the machinery. "You said a pattern," I said, my voice low. "She is the 7th in the last 24 months, Miss Dubois confirmed. 7 nuns, from 7 different convents in 5 different states. The others were similar. Sister Alina in Arizona, Sister Catherine in Louisiana, all devout, long-serving women. All vanished from secure locations without a trace, leaving behind their most cherished spiritual possessions. The only connections are their vocation and the sheer impossibility of their departure." She leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "The local authorities are useless. They see a runaway, not a puzzle. We, however, see a threat. To the women, to their orders, and to the stability we are tasked to protect. We need someone who can see the connections they miss. Someone who operates outside the system, who trusts facts over faith. We need you to find out what is happening to these women and why." It was insane. And yet, it was the most compelling mystery I had ever encountered. It wasn't about money or lust. It was about locked rooms and vanishing faith. It was a puzzle that defied the easy answers I had grown so weary of. "Where do I start?" I asked. Relief washed over her features, subtle but definite. "The Convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Solitude, Hemlock Creek, Pennsylvania." She slid a prepaid credit card and a new burner phone across the table. "Find a logical explanation, Mr. Thorne. We are praying you can." An hour later, I was on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, heading west. The city lights of Philadelphia bled away in my rearview mirror, swallowed by the stormy darkness. The manila folder lay on the passenger seat, the serene face of Sister Agnes staring up from the first page. The wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, smearing the world into a blur of headlights and rain. I was driving toward a secluded convent to solve an impossible disappearance, hired by a secret order I didn't understand. For the first time in years, I had no idea what I was getting into, and that was the most terrifying and exhilarating feeling of all. The drive west from Philadelphia was a descent into gray. The storm that had been a theatrical backdrop in the city became a consuming, physical presence on the rural highways of Pennsylvania. Rain hammered against the windshield of Elia's unremarkable sedan, the wipers fighting a losing battle. The world outside was a watercolor smear of skeletal trees and bleak, rolling hills. It was the perfect weather for a ghost story, he thought grimly, his hands tight on the wheel. The Convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Solitude announced itself not with a sign, but with a sudden, imposing presence. It rose from the mist-shrouded landscape like a stone fortress, a Gothic revival monolith of dark granite, its sharp gables and narrow, arched windows seeming to pierce the bruised sky. A high iron fence, rusted in places, enclosed the grounds. This wasn't a place of gentle retreat. It was a bastion, built to keep the world out or perhaps something in. He parked near the imposing oak doors and made a run for it, the cold rain seeping into the collar of his coat. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and old stone. A heavy, ornate iron knocker, shaped like a dove, was his only option. Its thud echoed, sounding unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence that even the storm couldn't fully penetrate. The door was opened a moment later by a young woman in a novice's simple habit. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and fear. She couldn't have been more than 19. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Elias Thorne, I have an appointment with the prioress." She nodded without a word, stepping back to let him into a dim, cold foyer. The air inside was still and smelled of beeswax, lemon oil, and something else. The faint, cloying scent of anxiety. She led him down a long, echoing hallway, their footsteps the only sound. The walls were lined with dark, severe portraits of past prioresses, their painted eyes seeming to follow his intrusion. He was shown into a small, Spartan office. A woman sat behind a heavy wooden desk, her hands clasped on its cleared surface. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s, with a face that looked as if it were carved from the same granite as the convent walls, all sharp angles and unyielding lines. This was Mother Superior Abigail. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady and clear, devoid of warmth, "thank you for coming on such short notice." She did not stand or offer a hand. "The circumstances seemed urgent," Elias replied, taking the simple wooden chair she gestured toward. Miss Dubois was very clear. The mention of the name brought a flicker of something to the prioress's eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or resignation. "Miss Dubois and her associates believe in efficiency. I believe in prayer. But as our prayers for Sister Agnes's return have so far gone unanswered, I will concede to efficiency." "The police report I was given was thin," Elias said, getting straight to it. "It concludes she left of her own accord." A humorless smile touched Mother Abigail's lips. "Sheriff Miller is a good man. He attends Mass every Sunday. But he sees a woman who took vows, and he cannot comprehend the complexities of that commitment. He sees a locked door and an empty bed and assumes she found a way to leave. A crisis of faith, he called it. He suggested she might be in a bus station in Pittsburgh by now, seeking a new life. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. A new life? Sister Agnes was 72 years old, Mr. Thorne. She had been in this convent for 54 years. This was her life. This was her family. This was her sanctuary. Tell me about her room. I will show you, she said, rising. We have left it untouched, just as we found it that morning. She led him up a narrow, winding staircase to the second floor. The corridor here was identical to the one below, a repeating pattern of wood and stone. She stopped before a plain wooden door, a small brass 12 affixed to it. This is it, she said softly, her composure cracking for the first time. A deep-seated worry lined her face. The night she disappeared, Sister Helen confirmed the door was locked from the inside, as was policy. In the morning, there was no response to our calls. We were forced to break the lock. Elias examined the splintered wood around the new hardware. He pushed the door open. The cell was small, barely large enough for the single cot, a small writing desk, a wooden wardrobe, and a nightstand. A single window, tall and narrow, was set deep into the stone wall. Elias immediately crossed to it. It was barred, the iron set directly into the stone, the gaps no wider than his fist. The window itself was latched shut from the inside. He turned back to the room. It was immaculate. The thin blanket on the cot was pulled taut, the pillow plumped. On the desk, a book of Psalms lay open, a simple wooden cross serving as a bookmark. Inside the wardrobe, 2 black habits hung neatly. Nothing was out of place. It was a room of profound order and peace, violently contradicted by the absence of its occupant. Sheriff Miller said she could have picked the lock, Mother Abigail said, her voice laced with scorn. Agnes had arthritis in her hands, so severe she could barely button her own habit. Elias knelt by the nightstand. Upon it sat a glass of water and a small, worn wooden rosary, its beads smoothed by decades of prayer. This was hers. It was her mother's, the prioress said, her voice dropping. Brought over from Ireland. She never ever went anywhere without it, not even to the chapel. It was her anchor to her God and to her past. For her to leave it behind is unthinkable. It is not a clue she left. It is a testament that she did not leave at all. Elias saw it then. It wasn't just a missing persons case. It was a violation of a sacred space, a rupture in the very fabric of their reality. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no rational explanation. It was as if the laws of physics had been momentarily suspended in this 10 by 10 foot room. He spent the next hour conducting his methodical search, though he knew it was futile. He ran his fingers along the stone floor, searching for scuffs or hidden panels. He checked the integrity of the window bars. He examined the dust on the wardrobe. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. It was a perfect, logical vacuum. Later, he spoke briefly with 2 other nuns in the sterile quiet of the common room. Sister Catherine, old and stoic, simply shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line, offering only, Agnes was at peace. The Lord works in ways we cannot fathom. But the other, the young novice who had let him in, Sister Mary, was visibly trembling. Was there anything unusual about Sister Agnes in the days before? Elias asked gently. Mary wrung her hands. Unusual, she was serene, but also distant. She looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. In the evenings, in the chapel, she would sit for hours after prayers ended. She wasn't praying, not in the usual way. She was just listening, her head tilted, as if hearing something the rest of us couldn't. It wasn't a frightening thing. It was like she was waiting for a visitor she was happy to receive. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively calm. A pale, watery sun struggled through the clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across the convent grounds. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine, a scent that felt too pure for the ugly business I was tangled in. My frustration, however, hadn't washed away with the rain. It was a knot in my gut, tightening with every dead end. I had spent the night in a small, sterile guest room, poring over my notes, the layout of the cell, the timeline, the interviews. It was a perfect, infuriating circle of logic. A person cannot simply cease to exist inside a locked room. Yet, Sister Agnes had. I needed a new approach. The how was a brick wall, maybe the why was a sledgehammer. I found Mother Abigail in the main chapel, not praying, but overseeing two novices polishing the brass railings of the altar. Her face was etched with a familiar mixture of authority and exhaustion. "Mother Abigail," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "I need to go through Sister Agnes's cell again." She turned, her expression hardening. "You have already examined it, Mr. Thorne, twice. There is nothing more to see." With all due respect, I wasn't looking for the right things, I countered, stepping closer. I was looking for an exit. A trick, a way out. Now I need to look for a reason. I need to look for Sister Agnes herself, what she was thinking, what she was feeling. People don't just vanish. They are taken or they choose to go. If she chose this, she left a reason why. It might not be a note on the pillow, but it's there. My words hung in the air between us. One of the novices dropped her polishing cloth with a soft thud. Mother Abigail stared at me, her dark eyes searching my face. I think she saw not just a hired detective, but a man as lost in this as she was. The desperation that had brought me here was still her master. "Very well," she conceded, her voice barely a whisper. "But I will accompany you." We walked back to the dormitory wing in silence. The lock on Agnes's cell turned with a heavy, final-sounding click. Inside, the room was just as I'd left it, cold, sparse, and haunted by an absence. The air was still and smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. While the prioress stood stiffly by the door, a sentinel in her own home, I began a more intimate search. I wasn't looking for loose floorboards or hidden panels anymore. I was looking for a hiding place born of privacy, not escape. I ran my hands over her thin mattress, checked inside the simple wooden crucifix on the wall. Nothing. I turned to the small bookshelf. It held a dozen volumes, Lives of the Saints, theological treatises, a well-worn Bible. Standard issue for a life of devotion. I started pulling them out one by one, shaking them, fanning the pages. The prioress watched my every move, her disapproval a palpable force. It was the last book, The Interior Castle by St. Teresa of Avila, that felt different. It was heavier than it should have been. I ran my thumb along the edge of the pages. Halfway through, they were stuck together. A faint line betrayed the truth. Using my thumbnail, I pried it open. The center of the book had been painstakingly hollowed out, creating a small, rectangular cavity. And nestled inside was a small, leather-bound journal, no bigger than my hand. "What is that?" Mother Abigail's voice was sharp, a whip-crack of alarm. I held it up. "I think it's the reason we've been looking for." I sat on the edge of the cot and opened it. The handwriting was a neat, controlled script, but the words themselves were anything but. These weren't daily affirmations or pious reflections. They were raw, cryptic, and unsettling. October 12th. The silence is different now. It used to be a comfort, a blanket. Now it has a voice. It sings a note so high and pure I feel it in my bones. It is a call. Am I the only one who hears it? October 19th. The others speak of God's voice as a whisper in the heart. This is not a whisper. It is a pulling, a current in a deep river, drawing me toward an unseen shore. Mother Abigail preaches of surrender, but this feels like an ascent. October 26th. I saw the door today in my prayers. Not of wood or iron, but of light. A passage that requires you to leave everything behind. Not just possessions, but weight, memory, self. A final pilgrimage from which there is no return journey. November 2nd. It is close now. The preparations are almost complete. I must become weightless. I left Mother's rosary on the table. It is the last anchor. To pass through, I must have nothing to hold on to and no one to hold on to me. It is not an ending. It is a transition. The last entry was dated the night she disappeared. I looked up at Mother Abigail. Her face was pale, her composure shattered. She looked horrified. This is delusion," she stammered. "Spiritual pride. To think she was receiving some special calling." "Maybe," I said, closing the journal. "Or maybe she was telling us exactly what happened." My mind was racing, trying to ground the unearthly words in some kind of reality. A fugue state? A mental breakdown? It still didn't explain the locked room. Leaving the prioress to her troubled thoughts, I decided to walk the grounds. I needed air. I found myself near the convent's small, walled cemetery. An elderly nun was tending to the graves, her back stooped with age. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, pulling weeds from around a weathered headstone. She looked up as I approached, her eyes roomy but sharp behind thick spectacles. Her name, I recalled from my initial interviews, was Sister Mary Catherine. "It is a peaceful place," she said, her voice thin and papery. "It is," I agreed, stopping a respectful distance away. "You've been here a long time, sister?" She nodded slowly. 53 years. I came here when I was a girl. I will be buried here next to my sisters." An idea, a long shot, began to form in my mind. 53 years, then you must remember everyone who has come and gone. Her eyes flickered with something. Not fear exactly, more like the memory of fear. "I do." I took a breath. "Did anyone else ever leave, unexpectedly?" Silence. She turned back to the gravestone, her knuckles white as she gripped her small trowel. "The prioress does not like us to speak of it." "The prioress isn't here," I said softly. "And another woman is gone, sister. Anything you know could help." She let out a long, shaky sigh that seemed to carry decades of weight. "It was a long time ago, before Mother Abigail was even prioress. A young sister, Therese, she was bright. Full of life, a little too much life, some said." "What happened to her?" I pressed. "One morning, she was gone," Sister Mary Catherine whispered, her eyes fixed on the distant woods. "Her door was locked, from the inside. The abbess at the time, Mother Cecilia, was a hard woman. She said Therese had found a way out, that she had shamed the order and run away with a man from the town. She had her name struck from our records. We were forbidden to pray for her." My blood ran cold. "Locked from the inside? Are you sure?" "I am sure," she said, finally looking at me. A single tear traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "I was the one who found her door was locked." I heard the silence from her room, the same silence that came from Agnes's room. The cold, damp air seemed to cling to Elias as he walked away from Sister Mary Catherine, the weight of her words heavier than the humid Pennsylvania twilight. Decades, this wasn't a freak occurrence. It was a pattern, a ghost haunting the stone walls of this place. The puzzle had shifted. He was no longer just looking for a missing woman. He was investigating a phenomenon, a dark tradition hidden beneath layers of piety and silence. He found Mother Abigail in her office, the single lamp on her desk casting long, severe shadows across her face. She was reviewing ledgers, her expression a mask of stern control. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Sister Therese," Elias said, his voice flat. He watched for a reaction, a flicker of an eyelid, a tightening of the jaw. He got it. Mother Abigail's pen stopped scratching. She slowly lifted her head, her dark eyes locking onto his. The mask didn't crumble, but cracks appeared at the edges. "I don't know what you're talking about. An elderly nun just told me a story about another sister who disappeared from a locked room decades ago." "A story you've all worked very hard to bury," Elias pressed, leaning his hands on the edge of her large oak desk. "Now it's happened again, on your watch. So I'll ask again, who was Sister Therese?" The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant drumming of rain against the window. For a long moment, Elias thought she would simply throw him out. Instead, a profound weariness seemed to settle over her. The formidable prioress deflated, sinking back into her chair like a marionette with its strings cut. "I was a novice when it happened," she finally whispered, her voice rough with unshed emotions. "Therese, she was vibrant, full of light, and then she was gone. The prioress at the time, Mother Cecilia, she made the decision. A scandal would have destroyed us. The questions, the police, it would have broken the faith of the sisters who remained. So it was decided that she simply left the order. It was a lie to protect the flock." "A lie that left the wolf inside the fence," Elias countered, his tone less accusatory now, more grimly factual. "You knew this could happen again." "I didn't," she insisted, her eyes pleading with a raw honesty he couldn't doubt. I never connected them. It was a tragedy from the past, a ghost story we told ourselves to forget. I never imagined, I never believed it was the convent itself. Her cooperation, born of fear and regret, was his key to the past. She led him to the convent's archives, a cramped, musty room in the basement. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper and forgotten history. Wooden shelves sagged under the weight of unlabeled boxes and leather-bound records. With a sigh, Mother Abigail left him to it, a warden granting access to her own prison of secrets. He spent hours sifting through dust-choked files. He finally found it, a thin manila folder with Thérèse Dubois typed on the label. The irony of the surname wasn't lost on him. Inside, there was barely anything: a birth date, an entry date into the novitiate, and a final, stark entry dated over 40 years ago. Departed the order. No reason, no forwarding address, no sign of a life before or after. It was an official erasure, as clean and complete as Agnes's disappearance. Frustrated, he returned to his small room and spread the pages of Agnes's journal across the bed. He read the cryptic entries again, this time with the knowledge of Therese's fate coloring every word. The final pilgrimage. One must become weightless to travel the oldest path. It wasn't just spiritual metaphor anymore. It was a script, a set of instructions. What was the oldest path? It had to mean something tangible, something physical. The convent records were a dead end. To find Therese and to understand Agnes, he had to look outside these walls. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, Elias drove his sedan down the winding gravel road, leaving the oppressive silence of the convent behind. He headed for the nearest town, Harmony Creek, a place that seemed to have been passed over by the last 50 years. It was a collection of brick storefronts, a single blinking traffic light, and a town square with a weary-looking gazebo. The county records office was a small, quiet annex of the library, manned by a woman who seemed surprised to have a visitor. He spent 2 hours searching for any public record of a Thérèse Dubois. Birth certificates, census data, property deeds. Nothing. It was as if she had been born inside the convent walls and ceased to exist the moment she vanished from them. It was a perfect, impossible disappearing act, performed twice. Defeated, Elias went to the town's only diner, the Creekside Cafe, for a cup of bitter coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for 2 old men in flannel shirts sitting at the counter, nursing their mugs. Their conversation drifted over the clatter of cutlery. "Always been strange up there on that hill," one of them said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Even before the sisters built that place. My granddad used to say the old mining company gave up on it for a reason," the other chimed in. Said the ground wasn't stable, talked about the whispering tunnels. Claimed on a quiet night, you could hear the wind moving through them like the whole hill was breathing. Elias froze, his own cup halfway to his lips. Whispering tunnels. "Just old stories," the first man chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Subsidence from the old iron ore shafts they dug back in the 1800s, all sealed up now, been sealed for 100 years. Elias' mind ignited. Sealed, just like the locked rooms. The oldest path, not a spiritual journey, but a physical one. A path that existed long before the convent, hidden right beneath their feet. A network of abandoned mine tunnels. A way in and a way out that no one would ever think to look for." He paid for his coffee and walked out into the persistent drizzle, his heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked back up the road, towards the hill where the convent stood silhouetted against the gray sky. It was no longer just a building of stone and faith. It was a superstructure, built on a foundation of secrets, both spiritual and terrifyingly real. The disappearances weren't impossible, they were just misunderstood. And now, he had to find a way into the dark. The drive back from town was a crawl through the inky blackness of the Pennsylvania countryside. The words from the diner, whispering tunnels, had hooked into my brain and wouldn't let go. It was the first tangible thing in a case built on faith, feelings, and phantoms. A physical path, a way out. The chill in my beat-up sedan had nothing to do with the failing heater, and everything to do with the cold, hard possibility that had just cracked the case wide open. I didn't bother waiting for morning. Pulling up to the convent, the stone facade looked more like a mausoleum than a place of worship under the stark moonlight. I bypassed the main entrance and went straight to the small side door used for deliveries, hammering on it until a light flickered on inside. A startled-looking novice, no older than 20, answered, clutching her robe. "I need to see the prioress," I said, my voice harsher than I intended. "Now." She led me not to the sterile meeting room, but to Mother Abigail's private office. The prioress was already there, seated behind her large oak desk, a book open but unread before her. She looked tired, the lines around her eyes deeper than I remembered. The illusion of unshakable authority had crumbled, replaced by a brittle wariness. "Mr. Thorne, this is highly irregular," she began, her voice a low hum of disapproval. I closed the door behind me, shutting out the nervous novice. "We're past irregular, Mother. We're in cover-up territory, and I just found what you were trying to bury." I didn't sit. I stood before her desk, letting the imbalance of power hang in the air. I was in town. It's funny what you overhear in a local diner. Old-timers talking about the history of this land, about the old coal mines. They have a name for them, the Whispering Tunnels. Her composure finally fractured, just for a second. A subtle flinch, a tightening of her hands on the desk. It was all the confirmation I needed. She had known all along there was a physical way out. "That is local folklore," she said, recovering, her voice thin. "Superstitious nonsense." "Is it?" Sister Therese vanishes from a locked room. Decades later, Sister Agnes does the same. You hide the first case, hoping it never happens again, but it does. You told me you covered it up to prevent a scandal. But you weren't just hiding a disappearance, were you? You were hiding a place. A path. These tunnels, they run under the convent grounds, don't they? Silence. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. I watched her, watched the internal battle play out across her face. The prioress, the keeper of secrets, was weighing the cost of one scandal against the certainty of a much larger one if I walked out that door and went to the state police with what I knew. Finally, she let out a long, shuddering breath. It was the sound of surrender. "You have no idea what you are meddling with, Mr. Thorne." "Then enlighten me," I said, my voice dropping. "Help me, and I can be discreet. Obstruct me, and this whole convent becomes a circus. Your choice." She stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and fear. "What do you want?" "A map, blueprints, anything showing the original foundation of this building. I want to know where the convent meets the mines." Without another word, she rose and walked to a tall, locked filing cabinet in the corner. The key she used came from a chain around her neck, hidden beneath the starched white fabric of her wimple. She didn't retrieve a neat, modern blueprint, but a long, rolled-up piece of yellowed parchment, bound with a faded ribbon. She unrolled it on her desk, the brittle paper crackling in protest. It was a hand-drawn architectural plan, dated 1889. The ink was faded, the writing an elegant, spidery script. "This convent was built in stages," she explained, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The original structure, the West Wing, was built directly over the service shafts of the then-defunct Blackwood mine. It was considered stable ground. The builders sealed the shafts, of course." Her finger, slender and pale, traced a line on the map. "This section here," she pointed to a cross-hatched area in what was now the deepest part of the convent's basement, "was the original root cellar. It would have been the closest point to the old shafts." "And where is that now?" I asked, leaning over the drawing. "It was bricked up decades ago, before my time, after a section of the floor became unstable. It's just a wall in the sub-basement now, used for storage." She rolled the map up and handed it to me. "Find what you are looking for, Mr. Thorne, and then leave us in peace." Armed with the map and a heavy maglite from my car, I descended into the convent's belly. The main basement was damp and smelled of earth and old laundry. Following the map's layout, I found the door to the sub-basement, a heavy wooden thing with a simple iron latch. The air grew colder, heavier, as I went down the stone steps. This area was clearly forgotten. Boxes of old hymnals, broken furniture, and discarded holiday decorations were piled everywhere, coated in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs. I navigated the maze, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive darkness. In the far corner, behind a stack of rotting wooden pallets, I found it. A section of the stone foundation that was different. The mortar was newer, cruder. A brick wall exactly where the map said the old cellar door should be. There was no handle, no lock, just a solid wall of brick and mortar. I ran my hand over the surface. It was cold, unnaturally so. I pressed my ear against it and listened. At first, nothing, just the silence of the deep earth, but then I heard it. A faint, low hum, a soft, airy hiss like a distant exhalation. The whisper. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled a crowbar from my tool bag. The first few bricks were the hardest, refusing to yield. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I worked, the rhythmic clang of steel on stone echoing in the confined space. Finally, one brick came loose, then another. I worked faster, pulling them out and dropping them to the dusty floor until I had a hole big enough to shine my light through. The beam was swallowed by an absolute, profound blackness. The musty smell that billowed out was ancient, a scent of decay and cold, unmoving air. I widened the hole, my breath coming in ragged gasps, a mix of exertion and raw anticipation. When the opening was large enough to squeeze through, I stopped, catching my breath. I peered into the void. It wasn't a cellar. It was the precipice of a tunnel. Rough-hewn rock walls glistened with moisture, and crude, steep steps descended into nothingness. This was it, the oldest path from Sister Agnes's journal, the secret exit, the path to becoming weightless. I stood at the threshold between the quiet solitude of the convent and the crushing dark of the earth below, realizing I had found the how. Now I had to go in there and find the why. The air that bled from the opening was ancient and cold, carrying the scent of deep earth, damp stone, and something else, a profound stillness, like a held breath. I stood there for a moment, the beam of my heavy-duty flashlight cutting a stark white tunnel into the absolute black. The rough-hewn passage descended at a gentle slope, just wide enough for one person to squeeze through. This was it, the impossible escape route made real by crumbling brick and century-old secrets. I checked my gear. Flashlight, spare batteries, a crowbar tucked into my belt, my phone for photos, and a bottle of water. I sent a quick, pre-written text to a trusted contact, my bail bondsman of all people. It just said, "Convent. If you don't hear from me by 6 a.m., call this number." The number belonged to Miss Dubois, a little insurance policy. Then, I switched my phone to airplane mode to conserve the battery and took a final breath of the dusty basement air before forcing my shoulders into the gap. The claustrophobia was immediate and oppressive. The rough stone walls scraped against my jacket, and I had to hunch over to keep my head from hitting the low ceiling. The silence was the most unnerving part. It was a physical presence, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the gritty floor and the sound of my own breathing, loud and ragged in the confined space. The flashlight beam bounced ahead, revealing little more than an endless throat of rock and dirt, shored up in places by rotting wooden beams that looked ready to collapse if I so much as sneezed. 10 minutes in, the passage remained unchanged, a monotonous, earthy prison. My city dweller's mind started playing tricks. Every drip of water from the ceiling sounded like a footstep behind me. Every scrape of my own gear against the rock was an unknown creature skittering away in the dark. Then I heard it. A low, mournful sigh that seemed to move through the very rock around me. The whispering tunnels. I froze, listening, my heart hammering against my ribs. It came again, a long, drawn-out moan. I was a cynic, a pragmatist. It was just wind, I told myself. Air moving through a complex warren of shafts, creating acoustic anomalies. It had to be. But knowing the rational explanation didn't stop the primal chill that snaked up my spine. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus on the floor. I was looking for anything. A footprint, a scrap of fabric, a sign. The ground was a mix of packed dirt and loose scree, making any tracks hard to discern. But then my light caught a glint of something small and dark, half buried in the grime near a rotting support beam. I knelt, my knees protesting on the hard ground, and carefully worked it free with the tip of a key. It was a rosary bead. Black wood, worn smooth with use, covered in a cake of dried mud. It wasn't from the pristine rosary sister Agnes had left on her bedside table. This was from a different set. It was proof. Tangible, physical proof that someone devout had passed this way. I bagged it carefully, a small knot of triumph tightening in my chest. I wasn't just chasing shadows anymore. I was following a trail. The single tunnel eventually opened into a small, circular junction where 3 other passages branched off into the darkness. A crossroads. The 19th century blueprint was useless here. It only showed the main shaft. I stood in the center, panning my light down each tunnel. They all looked identical, dark, foreboding, and silent. Which way had they gone? I started thinking like a pie again, not a spooked trespasser. I examined the entrance to each tunnel. The one on the left had a thick, undisturbed curtain of cobwebs hanging across it. Not that one. The one on the right seemed to slope downwards more steeply. The one straight ahead, however, the floor seemed slightly more scuffed, the dust less settled. And I could feel it ever so faintly. A draft. The air was moving, however weakly. Fresh air means an exit, or at least a larger space. I chose the middle path. This tunnel was narrower than the first, and the whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent. They sounded like voices now, a low, indistinct murmur that was always just at the edge of my hearing. I gritted my teeth, focusing on the feeling of the draft against my face. It grew stronger, the stale, subterranean smell giving way to something cleaner, laced with the scent of cool night air and pine. After what felt like an hour of shuffling and crawling, the tunnel began to widen. I could stand up straight. The floor became smoother, more level, as if intentionally flattened. Up ahead, the darkness wasn't as absolute. A faint, flickering glow painted the stone walls a soft orange. My first thought was fire. My second was people. I switched off my flashlight, plunging myself into near darkness, and slowed my approach. The last 20 feet were agonizingly slow. The light grew brighter, the air fresher. I reached the end of the tunnel and peered around the edge of the rock. What I saw stopped my breath. It wasn't a cave. It was a man-made chamber, perhaps 20 feet square, carved directly out of the rock. The ceiling was high and vaulted, like a chapel. The light came from a dozen thick, tallow candles set in niches along the walls, their flames dancing and casting long, wavering shadows. The space was tidy, organized. Along one wall were 3 simple wooden cots, each with a neatly folded wool blanket and a small, handmade cross hanging above it. On another wall, a makeshift altar had been constructed from a flat-topped boulder, holding a simple wooden crucifix and a worn Bible. But it was the third wall that made my blood run cold. Set into small, carved-out hollows were personal effects, not just for 2 people. There were at least a dozen hollows. In one, I saw a faded photograph of a young woman with her parents. In another, a small, leather-bound book of poetry. In a third, a silver locket. And below each hollow, a name and a date were painstakingly carved into the stone. Sister Therese, 1984. Sister Agnes, 2024. And others. Sister Bernadette, 2011. Sister Sophia, 1996. Sister Margaret, 1972. My mind struggled to process the information. This wasn't about 2 nuns vanishing. This was a system, an underground railroad, a carefully planned, secret exodus that had been going on for over 50 years. The final pilgrimage wasn't a metaphor for death or a mental breakdown. It was a literal journey, and this chamber was a way station. I wasn't at the end of the mystery. I was standing at the beginning of something far bigger and more profound than I could have ever imagined. The air in the hidden chamber was cold and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and extinguished candles. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the heartbreakingly personal memorials on the far wall. Agnes, Therese, a dozen others. Each name, carved with patient hands, was a testament to a life abandoned for something else. This wasn't a tomb, it was a departure lounge. The whispering tunnels weren't a myth, they were a meticulously planned escape route, an underground railroad for the devout. My eyes scanned the room again, looking for the next step. Where did the pilgrimage lead? The chamber felt like a terminus, but a faint, almost imperceptible draft caressed the back of my neck. It was the same current of air I had followed to get here. It had to have an origin and a destination. Turning away from the wall of names, I traced the feeling back towards the crude stone altar. Behind it, the rock face looked solid, but my light caught a subtle, unnatural seam near the floor. Kneeling down, my fingers found the edge of a large, flat stone that had been expertly fitted into the wall. It was heavy, but with a grunt of effort, I managed to pivot it aside, revealing another dark maw. This tunnel was different. The walls were reinforced with old timber beams, the floor flatter, less treacherous. It was built for travel, not just for hiding. Just inside the entrance, tucked into a small, carved-out alcove, sat a weathered tin lockbox. I pried it open. Inside, insulated by oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. I sat on the cold floor, the beam of my flashlight my only reading lamp, and began to turn the pages. The first entry was dated 1923. It was written in a beautiful, looping script by a woman named Sister Annalise. She wrote not of disappearance, but of deliverance. She described the convent as a gilded cage, a place where her spirit had begun to wither under the weight of ritual and isolation. She and a few others had discovered the old mining tunnels and saw not a hazard, but a path to a different kind of service, one lived in the world, not apart from it. Page after page told the same story, written by different hands over nearly a century. They called themselves the Sisters of the Way. They weren't rejecting their faith, they were trying to live it more authentically. The final pilgrimage wasn't a journey to death, but to a new life. The ledger was a manual, a history, and a statement of purpose. The last few pages were written by Sister Agnes. Her entries were filled with a palpable sense of anticipation and peace. She wrote of hearing the call in the whisper of the drafts, a physical sign she interpreted as a divine invitation. Her final entry, dated the night she vanished, was simple. "Tonight I walk the way, I am not lost, I am found." Tucked into the back of the ledger was a hand-drawn map. It showed the tunnel network extending another mile, ending in a secluded valley northwest of the convent grounds. My heart pounded. This was it, the final destination. I packed the ledger back in its box, slid it deep into my coat pocket, and stepped into the passage, pulling the stone shut behind me. The walk was long and mentally taxing. The darkness was absolute, broken only by my flashlight. The silence was so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upwards. The air grew fresher, carrying the scent of pine and wet leaves. Ahead, I saw a faint glimmer of natural light. The exit was disguised as a collapsed section of a narrow cave, hidden behind a thicket of overgrown rhododendrons. I pushed through the branches and stepped out into the crisp morning air of a hidden valley. It was a sanctuary. A handful of simple, well-kept wooden cabins were clustered around a large, tilled garden. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney on a larger communal building. A few women in simple, practical clothing, not habits, were tending to the crops, their movements unhurried and peaceful. And then I saw her. Near a chicken coop, scattering feed on the ground, was a woman whose face I recognized from the photograph in her file. Sister Agnes. She looked up as I approached, her eyes showing not alarm, but a calm, knowing curiosity. She wasn't the haunted, distant woman the other nuns had described. Here, she looked vibrant, her face clear and her posture relaxed. She was home. "You must be Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice even. Mother Abigail said a man was asking questions. I suppose we knew it was only a matter of time before someone was persistent enough. "You don't seem surprised," I stated, my own voice sounding harsh in the tranquil air. "Surprised? No, a little sad perhaps. We value our peace." She gestured to the valley around us. "This is our convent, Mr. Thorne, our true one. We live simply. We grow our own food. We offer shelter and aid to those who need it. runaway kids, women fleeing bad situations, people who fall through the cracks. We do it quietly, without the bureaucracy or the judgment. We are living our vows of service, just in a way the church would not sanction. The Veritas Commission thinks you're victims of some sinister plot, I told her. A wry smile touched her lips. I imagine they would. It's easier to believe in evil kidnappers than in women who simply choose a different path to God. We are not prisoners, Mr. Thorne. We have never been more free. I stood there for a long moment, the ledger in my pocket feeling impossibly heavy. I had been hired to uncover a threat, to solve a dark mystery. But there was no mystery here, only a quiet, powerful truth. These women had built a utopia of faith and practical compassion. To expose them would be to destroy them. It would mean dragging them back to a life they had bravely chosen to leave behind, all for the sake of an organization's rigid control. I looked at Agnes, at the unshakable peace in her eyes, and my decision was made. For the first time in a long time, the cynical armor I wore every day felt like a burden I no longer wanted to carry. Your secret is safe, I said, my voice softer now. As far as anyone will know, the tunnels collapsed. You were lost. It was a tragedy. Relief, deep and profound, washed over her face. Thank you, she whispered. I walked back through the tunnel, the journey feeling lighter this time. In the sub-basement of the convent, I used a crowbar from my car to collapse the entrance to the passage, bringing down rock and dirt until it was completely sealed. It now looked like what it was always supposed to be, a dangerous, impassable dead end. 2 days later, I sat across from Miss Dubois in the same sterile Philadelphia office building. I handed her my final report. Sister Agnes suffered a crisis of faith, which she detailed extensively in her journal, I explained, sliding a carefully curated selection of Agnes's more distressed entries across the table. Evidence suggests she found a way into the old mine shafts beneath the convent. The tunnels are unstable. I found this near a recent collapse. I placed the single, mud-caked rosary bead on the polished table. I believe the passage she used is now permanently blocked. Tragically, it seems she perished down there, seeking an escape she never found. The case of Sister Therese from decades ago appears to be a sad, unrelated precursor. Miss Dubois picked up the bead, her expression a mixture of disappointment and grim acceptance. The grand conspiracy she imagined had dissolved into a simple, human tragedy. It was a neater, albeit less exciting, conclusion. A waste, she murmured, closing the file. Thank you for your diligence, Mr. Thorne. Back in my own dusty office, overlooking the gray expanse of the city, I poured myself a whiskey. The check from the Veritas Commission sat on my desk, but my mind was elsewhere. It was in a sun-drenched valley in rural Pennsylvania, where a group of women were quietly living out their faith on their own terms. I was hired to find lost nuns. Instead, I found a sanctuary, and in leaving it undisturbed, in choosing their truth over my clients, I felt like I had finally found a small piece of my own.